Okay. Sorry about the 2 weeks off, but we're back. And finally, we're here for part 10 of our continuing series on the fourth chapter of Bava Metzia. We're going to be starting on page 48a and going all the way to 49a. It's I guess 48b must be short. Problem with learning on computer is that I never actually see the shapes of the pages anymore, though, so I'm just guessing that. All right. In any case, we are still, at least at the beginning, we're still involved in this discussion of whether the original way of buying movable objects in the Torah was by paying money for them, and then once you paid the money, the object would belong to you. And the rabbis changed the rule and made it so that the transaction is actually not finished until the merchandise is delivered, or whether the original system, even under the Torah, was that the transaction doesn't finish until the merchandise is delivered. The first position in what I just described is Rabbi Yochanan. The second position is Reish Lakish. And we are sort of almost done with that discussion, but we start out still in it, and it's kind of gonna haunt us for a while, so don't totally put it away. Okay, so the very last bit of the Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish bit, which I suppose belonged at the end of class 9, but apparently I didn't put it there, so let's finish it. Is V'chein Amar Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman also said, so he also not agrees with the thing immediately before him. Actually, he agrees with what was several pieces earlier. So the also probably just means also he has an opinion about this. He said, Davar Torah Ma'ot Konot. That the original Torah law was that the money, the coins, complete the transaction. And so he's agreeing with Rabbi Yochanan. Uvadka Levi b'matnite, and Levi went through all of his brightot, and he found the following brightot, which we've not mentioned until now. Nitana l'siton ma'al. So a siton is a wholesaler, and apparently you paid this wholesaler in parts. You'd give them a down payment at the beginning of the, it's not clear to me whether it's the beginning of the transaction or just the beginning of the season. And then over time, they would deliver you large amounts of merchandise, which you would sell. And then once you sold it, you'd have the money to buy it. But I think this is a system for storekeepers who don't actually have the capital up front to buy the merchandise. So all they do is make a deposit on it at the beginning. In any case, if that deposit that they gave at the beginning of the season included a coin that belonged to the Beit HaMikdash, then giving it to the Siton constitutes Me'ilah, according to this Breita that Levi found, which should mean that some kind of transaction is being completed, because in order for it to be Me'ilah, you have to have, bought something for it. So it sounds like, at least according to this Breita, just giving somebody a coin in return for merchandise that we don't even know what kind of merchandise. But I think it's green normally for a acetone, but I'm not sure, and I should probably not assert that without knowing what I'm talking about. But this Breita seems to think that whatever it is, you now own some of it as a result of giving the coins. So that would be Elakasha Reish Lakish. That would be a problem for Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan are Amoraim. They're very early Amoraim, but they're still Amoraim, and they're not allowed to contradict the Tannaitic record. But they are allowed to take sides among Tanaim, and so Reish Lakish we're going to imagine for Reish Lakish the same answer here that we've imagined him giving before, which is Amar Lecha Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish would say to you, Hamani Rabbi Shimon he. Well, okay, who's the author of that Breita? The author of that Breita must be Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon was also in our Mishnah. Our Mishnah had a dispute in it about whether once the buyer has paid the money, but the seller has not yet delivered the merchandise, whether the buyer and the seller can both renege on the deal. And the Tanakama in the Mishnah had said that both sides can back out, but we curse them if they do. And Rabbi Shimon had said only the person who's holding the money, who after in the case we're talking about has to be the seller, only the seller can back out. And Reish Lakish's interpretation of that had been that this same dispute that Reish Lakish has with Rabbi Yochanan is reflected in this earlier Mishnah, that the first position, the majority position in the Mishnah, is Reish Lakish himself, saying that the Torah thinks that transactions aren't done until the merchandise is delivered, while Rabbi Shimon holds that the transaction is completed, or at least something has happened once the money is delivered. Whether that's because Rabbi Shimon thinks that the transaction is actually completed, and he's like a super Rabbi Yochanan position, in which not only does he think that's the original Torah position, but he also doesn't think anything's changed. Or whether Rabbi Shimon is more like Rabbi Yochanan, and he thinks, well, it used to be the rule that giving over the money would complete the transaction, and he thinks that's enough to affect who can back out here, because at least the Torah thinks the transaction is over. One way or the other, Rabbi Shimon is more on Rabbi Yochanan's side than the Tanakama is, and so Reish Lakish has always perceived this as a dispute that he's just taking sides in, and his interpretation of the Mishnah was always that he was taking the majority position against the minority position. And so he's gonna, any individual Breita that we find, especially if it doesn't have a name associated with it, Reish Lakish is just gonna say, well, yeah, we knew there was a position like that, and the majority voted against it, and I rule like the majority, so that doesn't disprove me. And so we're concluding that again here, and we have come to the end of the official discussion of Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan without coming to any kind of conclusion about who's right, which is not terribly unusual. All right, moving on to the next bit in our Gemara, which is on the one hand separate because it's associated with the next piece of the Mishnah, and on the other hand it's connected because it's going to also end up being about the question of whether down payments make a difference or not, which we've already sort of touched on with the wholesaler here in Levi's Breita. Okay, so the next line in the Mishnah was Aval Amru Misha Para, etc. So the Mishnah had said that if you do back out from the deal, I guess the agreement, after the money has been paid but before the merchandise is delivered, or possibly even at some earlier point, but certainly at that point, if you back out, then you get cursed with this curse that was, the God who cursed the God who punished the generation of the flood and the generation of the separating, which is the Tower of Babel. He'll also find a way to punish you. Okay, so we now have a new machloket about that. Itamar, Abaye Amar, Odue Modinale. Abaye, so we have the following statement. Abaye says that this Mishnah means that if somebody backs out of a deal, then we tell him that it's likely that God is going to punish him. This is just a matter of telling people that we think this is how the theology operates. It's not actually a curse in that sense. We're not wishing that it will happen. We're just announcing that it's likely to happen. Rava Amar, Mele Laitina. Rava says, on the other hand, no, this is actually a curse. We are trying to produce a result in which God is going to punish this person by saying this. And sorry, hold on a second. Okay, that's better. Okay. Abaye Amar Odeh Modina. So now we're going to explain why each of them takes their position. Abaye says it's really just a notification. Dichtiv v'nasi ba'amcha lo ta'or. So you have this pasuk in I think it's in Parshat Mishpatim in Shmot that says that it's forbidden to curse a nasi in your people. I translated nasi as leader because nasi has an assortment of different meanings. In Chumash itself, it seems to be a tribal leader, although the spies that we send into Israel in Parshat Shlach are also described as Nisi'im, and they're not listed as tribal leaders. So it may be a broader term than that, even in Chumash. And by the time you get later on in Jewish history, it just seems to be a vague descriptor for somebody with political power. Sometimes in the Gemara, it even means a king. But more importantly, in our case here, Abaye seems to be assuming that this prohibition not to curse a leader actually extends to everybody. He's reading it as don't curse anybody, and the leader is just an example. And so Abaye appears to be asserting that we don't curse people. Cursing people is wrong. Therefore, it can't possibly be that the Mishnah is telling us to curse somebody. Okay, as opposed to Rava Amar, Rava says we curse him, Dichtiv be'amcha, because in the same pasuk that Abaye quoted, it said, don't curse a leader among your people. But he says that means ba'osei ma'aseh amcha, somebody who does the actions of your people. That's who you shouldn't curse. And this would tend to indicate that people who violate social norms are not protected by this rule. Or possibly people who violate legal norms. I don't know, but people who break the rules aren't protected. So Rava thinks it's just fine, according to this pasuk, to curse people if they break the rules, and possibly it's even appropriate to curse people because they break the rules, although that might be a step too far. I'm not sure. Okay, Amar Rava. Furthermore, Rava has a reason why he thinks this. Mina. So Rava says, you want to know why I think this, what my source that I think it can prove this position. It's the following story. Rabbi Chia bar Yosef Yahavule Zuze Amilcha. We don't know who they is, but presumably Rabbi Chia bar Yosef's employer or somebody who asked him a favor, we don't know, gave Rabbi Chia bar Yosef money to go buy salt. Presumably an amount of salt that was large enough that it mattered what the price was. And we're kind of used to salt being a super cheap thing in our marketplace, but historically that has not been the case, and salt was historically often quite expensive. In any case, apparently at this point he made a deal, and then L'sof Yakar Milcha, and then the salt went up in value. So so Rabbi Chia bar Yosef came to Rabbi Yochanan to ask what to do. It seems like at this point he's bought the salt, and now he is stuck in a position of having to sell it at a price that's not to the advantage of his employer. So he goes to Rabbi Yochanan and he says, "Look, what do I do? I made this deal, but my investor, my employer, is not going to benefit from this transaction anymore. What should I do?" So Amar le zil havlehu. He said, "No, you got to go and give it to them. You have to sell them the salt for this price." Yes, there seems to be a lot of yeah, Harvey, that's true. Salt was much more valuable when it was necessary as a preservative before there was refrigeration and we could put things in freezers. But I think it was also just harder to get. It required more manpower. But in any case, there's seem to be a lot of details missing from this story, and it's going to turn out there are even more missing once we start trying to analyze it. But let's try to at least understand a surface understanding of approximately what's going on here. So Rabbi Yochanan tells him you have to give it to them. You have to follow through on this transaction, even though you haven't delivered the salt yet. V'ilo kabil alecha alayich mishapara, and if not, you're going to receive, or you're going to be accepting on yourself, a mishapara, this promise from the Mishnah that the God who punishes people is going to punish you. Now, that doesn't directly tell us which meaning of these words he intends, but Rava thinks he can intuit it based on the case. So Rava says, and if you say, like Abaye did, that the Mishnah is just talking about, informing him that God is likely to punish him, then Rabbi Chia bar Yosef bar Oduyelihu, Rabbi Chia bar Yosef doesn't need to be informed. He's apparently a rabbi. Presumably, I think we can assume that he knows the content of the Mishnah. So his question that Rabbi Yochanan's answer to him has to have been more contentful than just reciting a Mishnah back at him, or there'd be no point in this conversation. So the Elamai, in which case what? In which case it must be that milate my laitinan. It must be that Rava thinks that what the Mishnah is talking about, what Rabbi Yochanan is doing, is cursing him. And it sounds like Rabbi Yochanan is either threatening to curse him or is conditionally cursing him. I'm not sure which. I'm not actually sure if there's a difference, but something like that. Yes, John.
Going back a little bit, some salt was bought.
Yes.
After the salt was bought, the value of salt went up.
It seems like there's another step in between, which is that Rabbi Chia bar Yosef bought the salt, and then he transacted to sell the salt, and then the price went up before he actually delivered it. But it's not his salt. He's operating for his investors, and he's concerned that he needs to do whatever is appropriate to protect their money.
And the investors are the buyers or someone else?
No, I think the investors are the people who originally gave him the money to buy the salt with.
Okay.
And I would imagine at the end, he's responsible to go back and tell them, we made a profit and here's your money.
So he was buying the salt for them to use or to resell?
I think he's buying it for them in order to resell it.
Okay.
That's my impression.
But I don't see why they'd be upset if suddenly what they bought for 3 shekels is suddenly worth 6 shekels.
Right. Well, so the problem is that he bought it for, let's use multiples of 10 because it's simpler that way. He bought it for 10, and now he's transacted to sell it for 20. But in the meantime, it turns out that it's really worth 50. So he goes to Rabbi Yochanan and he's like, this isn't my salt. Right? Like if I don't have to deliver it in return for 20, then presumably I have a fiduciary duty to refuse to finish the transaction and sell it to somebody else for 50 so that I can go back to my employer and give them all the money. But if I do have a responsibility to finish the transaction, then I can't, then I don't have that fiduciary duty. I think that's what's happening here. Okay. So, but in any case, it seems that Rabbi Yochanan told him he can't back out of whatever it is that he's doing. And Rava is trying to use this to demonstrate the fact that Rabbi Yochanan's instruction to him not to back out contains the statement that if he does back out, he'll be subject to this curse. Rava thinks that means it has to be an actual curse, because if it were just telling him what the rules are, Rabbi Chia bar Yosef should already know that, and he doesn't need to have that conversation in that case. But the Gemara doesn't like that. because it says Rabbi Chia bar Yosef atal kule leituta derabanan. He said, wait a minute. Having Rabbi Chia bar Yosef ask a dumb question and get a line from a Mishnah as an answer may have been an implausible interpretation of the Mishnah, but having Rabbi Yochanan threaten him with a curse from the rabbis is also not a plausible interpretation of the story. Rabbi Chia bar Yosef, there's no possibility that he would really accept the curse. So why is Rabbi Yochanan threatening him in that case? Why didn't he just tell him, no, go deliver the salt? So it must be that something more complicated is happening here. Ella Rabbi Chia bar Yosef a ravon hu diyahavile. It must be that Rabbi Chia bar Yosef had in fact made a down payment, accepted a down payment. They gave Rabbi Chia bar Yosef a down payment. I'm sorry, I typed that wrong. The buyers had given him a down payment, and he's not sure to what extent that means he's already sold the salt. Hu savar kenegdohu kone. He thinks, so keeping with our numbers that we had before, he's selling the salt for 20, and these people gave him, I don't know, 5 as their down payment. So now he thinks maybe in fact that means that only a quarter of the salt is sold. I could deliver the salt they already paid for, renege on the rest of the deal, and go sell the rest of the salt at the higher price. But the Amarli Rabbi Yochanan keneged kula hukona. Rabbi Yochanan tells him, no, I'm sorry, that's not how down payments work. The way that down payment works is that the down payment has already affected the purchase, or at least to the extent of creating a curse if you back out. To the extent that the down payment works to sort of start finishing the deal, it works on the entire merchandise. So the whole collection of salt is now sort of purchased instead of just the part that they actually paid for. And so if you back out of any part of it, you're going to subject yourself to this curse, not just the part that's the amount that they paid for. Which is now going to lead us to questioning whether actually that's true or not. But at this point, the way that we're leaving the analysis of the story, before we go off on our tangent to determine whether in fact it's true that a down payment attaches itself to the whole purchase rather than to just a proportionate amount of the purchase, we seem to be leaving this story with an interpretation that does not especially support Rava. Rava said the only way to understand this so that it's not just a waste of everyone's time for Rabbi Yochanan to recite a Mishnah at Rabbi Chia bar Yosef is to say that that there's a real curse here, so that the rabbi would have to actually articulate it for it to happen. So it matters whether you say it, even if the other person already knows about it. And in the end, we've come to an understanding in which that's not at all what's happening. What's happening is that Rabbi Chia bar Yosef doesn't know the law in his case, because he isn't sure how much of this deal he's really committed to if he accepted a down payment for part of it. And he is asking Rabbi Yochanan for advice about that issue. And Rabbi Yochanan is responding, no, actually, you're bound to the entire deal for the Mishnah that says that you could back out, but you shouldn't, and God will get you if you do. Okay, so it no longer has anything to do with the issue between Rava and Abaye. And if, in fact, that was the only reason that Rava was holding his position, Rava should rethink his position, because it doesn't sound like he has any evidence. On the other hand, Abaye never presented us any evidence really to begin with. So, I mean, they each presented their interpretation of the pasuk about whether you can curse people, but Abaye never presented any evidence about this particular case. So it may be in the end that neither of them has any evidence, and we're back to it being a draw. Okay, moving along to the question of down payments, which we are now going to go sideways into. It's a Ravon. So if somebody paid a down payment, Rav Amar Kenegdohu Koneh, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Keneged Kulahu Koneh. So it looks like we actually have a very old dispute going back to the first generation of Amoraim about how much of a deal a down payment secures. And by secure, for the moment, let's assume that what I mean is that if you're trying to buy movable property, then the down payment puts the other person, it puts the seller in a position where if they would now back out, God would get them. It doesn't actually buy anything, but it does put the seller into a position where they're a bad person if they back out. And Rav says that only works for the amount of the merchandise which you've actually paid for. So if your down payment is a 25% down payment, then now 25% of the merchandise is secured in this. The other person will be a sinner if they don't give it to you. And Rabbi Yochanan says, no, it secures the entire purchase. Okay. So now we're going to bring a Braita to challenge one of these people. So somebody who gives a down payment to his friend, the Amarlo, and he says to him, presumably the person giving the down payment says to the person receiving the down payment, the buyer says to the seller, he says, if I back out then of the deal, then you can keep the down payment. Right? I will forfeit it. V'hala amarlo, and the other person, the seller, said to him, Iman yachzor bi achpolach ervoncha. He says, if I back out of the deal, then I will double your down payment. I think that means I will give you back your down payment and I will also pay you that same amount of money. But I guess it's possible to read it as I will give you back your down payment and I will also pay you twice that amount of money. I'm actually not sure exactly which of those things it is, but it doesn't really matter for our purposes because Rabbi Yosei is going to be the only person who's willing to accept any version of this. Nitkaimu etznaim divrei Rabbi Yosei. Rabbi Yosei says that the conditions stand because in general, Rabbi Yosei believes that something called an asmachta works. All right, as the next line says, Rabbi Yosei l'ta'amei de'amar asmachta kain. Rabbi Yosei is being consistent because he generally thinks that asmachta works. Now, asmachta is a commitment to do something which at the time when you're making the commitment is unlikely enough that we don't really believe you've committed. Right? You're only committing to it because you don't think it's going to happen. This is, for example, according to many people, the legal problem with gambling, right? At the time when you agree to pay if your horse loses its race, you don't really think the horse is going to lose its race. That's why you're betting to begin with, is because you think your horse is going to win. And so you're not really agreeing to pay. And so when the other person collects your gambling debts later, they're stealing from you, right? That's one of the constructions of what's wrong with gambling. That's what we would call an asmachta problem, right? And similarly here, the person who says, I agree to forfeit my down payment if I back out, that person doesn't really think that they're going to have to forfeit it, although they may not be the one that's the problem, because having actually handed over the money, according to some people, that's actually not asmachta. But the other person, the seller, who says, if I back out, I'll double the down payment, that's definitely an asmachta according to everybody. Because the only reason they're agreeing to do that is because they don't really think they're ever going to have to. There is a position that something can't be an asmachta if you've actually put the money down already. It's only an asmachta if you're still holding the money. So that's why I'm not sure that what the buyer is doing here is an asmachta, but the seller is doing is for sure. In any case, that's why Rabbi Yosei in general thinks you can make implausible commitments and they're binding. And so he agrees to these conditions. But Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon and Gamliel are going to have sort of more normal positions. So let's read them. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Dayoshi Kneged Irvono. Rabbi Yehuda says the only effect of putting down the down payment is that it commits you to its to the amount that it is the amount of the purchase that it is proportionate to. Right? So if you are agreeing to pay 100 for something and you put down 30, then now 30% of whatever it is that you're buying, there's a real commitment to. But Rabbi Yehuda does not buy any other part of the of these conditions. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. So Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, yes, John.
We talked before about the situation where the price of something has considerably increased.
Mm-hmm.
So if I've made a down payment, does the seller have to give me the original value? Or, I mean, if the price is double, does he have to give me the original agreed amount or half of the agreed amount?
So I think I think the answer is that it's proportional at the price that you agreed to. So you would be, according to Rav up above and according to Rabbi Yehuda here, if you put down 30 on you put down $30 on $100 purchase, then now 30% of whatever it is you're buying, they have to sell to you at that price, or I mean, they already sold it to you at that price. They have to deliver the merchandise at that price, or they get cursed. But the other 70%, they can say, I'm sorry, sir, but that's not the price anymore. And there's no consequences for that. As opposed to Rabbi Yochanan up above, who would say, no, now they have to deliver all of the merchandise at the original price. You pay the other $70, they give you the rest of the merchandise, and you have to follow through, or they get cursed. And Rabbi Yosei, who would say they have to follow through, they have to give you all of the merchandise at the original price, and if they don't, they get cursed, and they also have these other consequences because they agreed to them. So that would, I mean, that's being cursed is bad, but a financial disincentive is presumably more successful in stopping you from backing out because the price changed. Because if you're going to lose the money anyway, you might as well finish the deal. But I guess it depends on how much the price changed. But nothing's perfect. Okay, so Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, Medvar Mamarim. So what kind of case are we talking about? Bizmat Amarlo Ervonio Yikom. Only in a case where the buyer said, my down payment is going to become yours. It sounds like otherwise, if you didn't say my down payment will become yours, then Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel actually thinks that the down payment has no effect at all. It does nothing. Okay. Except presumably that you have to come back and you want to come back and retrieve it. So you're not just going to completely walk away from the sale because you want your money back. But it doesn't sound like it stops you from backing out. Okay. Aval machar lo bait o sadeh be'elev zuz. Excuse me. But if he sold him a house or a field for 1,000 zuz, uparalo mehen 500 zuz, and he only paid half. He only paid 500 zuz. Pana umachzir lo et hashar afil lachar kama shani. It sounds like that would work completely. The whole transaction is, oh, I'm sorry. It sounds like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, I'm sorry, thinks that I skipped ahead to a later part of the Gemara. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel here thinks that when he says it, that's only if you say my down payment will be yours. It means that if you didn't say my down payment will be yours, you're actually committing yourself to the whole transaction. If you make a down payment, and then that's why now this person who paid 500 for a deal of 1,000 needs to finish the transaction. He doesn't have a choice. Even if he went away, he comes back, it's several years later, the seller can still make him cough up the rest of the money. Okay, so that's the end of the Breita. Now we need to analyze this and figure out what it means. Excuse me. My love, hu adin l'metaltalin. Is it not the case that the same thing would be true for movable property? Because notice that our case in the Breita was about a field or a house. That was about real estate. And the Gemara says no. Metaltalin b'destama lo kani. Now apparently the default with real estate, if you didn't say what the down payment is supposed to do, the default is that with real estate, the down payment is for the whole deal. But the down payment, now we're saying for movable property, is that it doesn't buy anything unless you say what it does. Umayshna karka, why should real estate be different? The kasba kanile mamash, kanile lakule. Because the difference is that with real estate, remember we said that with movable property, a transaction is completed when you hand over the property you're selling. You can't do that with land. There is no such thing. The land is going to stay where it is, no matter who owns it. So we need a different process for selling land. And in fact, one of the processes for buying land is paying the money. And so since paying the money is actually completes the transaction for purchasing land, right? This is mostly dealt with in the first chapter of Kiddushin, not here, but we're sort of like visiting that for a minute. Since the way you buy land is by delivering the money, delivering money also as a sort of an outsized consequence here, that even though you didn't deliver all of the money, it still finishes the transaction because money actually does something with real estate. So it's a more successful kind of transaction. Metaltali delo kani elo lekibule mishapara. But with movable property, where all the money can do is put you in a position where if you don't finish the transaction, you're going to get cursed. Lo kani lekule, it doesn't do much. It doesn't secure the entire transaction because it's not really doing anything to begin with. Okay, so lema katanai. Let's say that this is like the following dispute between Tanai. Hamalver savero al hamashkon v'nichnesa hashmita. So suppose that you lend somebody money and you collect a security from them, a physical object, which it's not the plan that they will pay you necessarily with this object, but you're holding their diamond ring or whatever until they pay you back. Okay. And then Shemitah starts. Person owes you $1 million. You're holding their diamond ring. And now it's Shemitah. Now, the question is, what is the status of this loan? If an unsecured loan would vanish when Shemitah started. So what happens here? So even though the collateral, which in this case we call the diamond ring, is only worth half of the loan. So, it's a very expensive diamond ring, but it's only a $500,000 diamond ring, as opposed to the $1 million the person owes you. Rabbi Shimon says, nonetheless, the loan is not canceled. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi Omer, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who is, I believe, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel's grandson. Son. I never get this right. In any case, doesn't matter. But he says, Im hayam mashkon keneged halva'ato, eno mishamet, v'im lav mishamet. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says, if the collateral was worth the entire amount of the loan, then it's not canceled, and otherwise Shemitah cancels it. Which seems to mean that he doesn't really think that collateral does anything. But if it happens to be that it's the same amount as the amount the person owed you, then you could just say, well, I mean, you did pay me. I have your $1 million right here in the form of your diamond ring. So your loan is not canceled because it's already been paid and it's my ring. Right? But short of that, he doesn't seem to think that collateral has any effect. So the question is, when Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says the loan's not canceled, what does he mean? Right? Because we had there a loan that was double the amount of the collateral. So how much of this loan is not being canceled? Ilema Kenegdo, if we say that the amount that's not being canceled is just the part that corresponds to the collateral, so it's only half of the loan that's not being canceled, then Michlad Rabbi Yehuda Nasi Savar Lahach Haga Nami Mishamet. That implies if Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says that it's proportional, then remember that whatever it is Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel is canceling, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi thinks is not canceled. So that would imply that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi thinks that nothing is canceled. nothing is secured. The whole thing is canceled. In which case, so why would it? What's the point in taking a collateral if the collateral doesn't actually secure the loan and you still lose the loan? That doesn't make any sense. Rather, in fact, that it can't mean that, so it must mean this next thing. What is it that's not canceled according to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel? It must be that Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel thinks the whole thing is secured by the collateral, that you are holding a $500,000 ring, and that causes your entire $1 million investment in this loan to be secured. None of it is canceled by Shemitah. And in that case, what is it that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is saying is canceled by the Shemitah, despite the collateral? Rabbi Yehuda Nasi must be saying that it's the other half that is canceled, right? The half that you're holding the collateral for, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi would say that part's not canceled, and he just thinks the other part is canceled, which presumably means that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi thinks that the collateral has, when it's being deposited with you as collateral for the loan, it's kind of already been traded for the money that you owe. In the sense that you've what you really did when you deposited, if the collateral is preventing the cancellation of Shemitah, then it must be that what the collateral is doing is you really already paid off your loan by giving this diamond ring. Just, you have an option to buy the ring back if you want to. But the ring belongs to the other person as a payment for the loan. The loan no longer exists. And now you just have a temporary option to buy your ring back if you wanted to. Like a pawn shop. Which more or less does this transaction as its primary mode of business. Okay. But we reject that. Look, nope, we do not like that. My Eno Mishamet Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. What in fact does Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel mean when he says it doesn't cancel? He must mean because we don't like the other way, because what it meant was that in order to secure the whole loan with the collateral, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel would have to have believed that you were able to pay off the whole loan with a ring that's only worth half as much as the loan. Apparently, we're not prepared to believe that. Okay, so what must Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel really mean when he says "Eino mishamet"? It doesn't cancel. And it must be that he's just talking about the half that does correspond to the collateral. Michlal de Rabbi Yehuda Nasi Savar lahach palga denakit ale mashkon nami mishamed. Which, as we said before, if that's what Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel thinks is being canceled, then Rabbi Yehuda Nasi thinks it's not being canceled, which means Rabbi Yehuda Nasi thinks that there's no that the whole thing is in fact being canceled. There is in fact no security being offered by this collateral at all. It does nothing. So in that case, Ela Mashko did not get Lamale. So in that case, why would I bother to collect this diamond ring to begin with if it doesn't stop the system from canceling my loan? That seems kind of pointless. Lizichron Devarim Ba'alma. It's just a reminder. Meaning, until the moment when Shemitah starts, the diamond ring is being held by the lender so that the borrower can't forget that they owe the money. They can't. They have to at least wait until Shemitah to not pay the money. But the moment that Shemitah happens, the fact that you already have the diamond ring does nothing to stop it from being a loan. And in fact, Shemitah successfully cancels the loan, and presumably at that point, the lender has to give back the ring. I imagine they'd be very unhappy about that, but that sounds like that's what we're concluding Rabbi Yehuda Nasi would require. All right, that is what I have for this evening. Do we have questions? Yes, John.
It seems to me that a house, which in some sense usually cannot be subdivided, is different from land, where where my intuition says that if I paid for half the land, and then I can take possession of half the land, but not the whole land.
I suspect the same thing is true of a building, in the sense that you could take possession of some of the rooms of the building, or you could take possession of the building only Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or right, like there are ways you could divide a house also. And with pieces of land, depending on how big they are and what they're intended for, they may also not be so easy to subdivide.
Okay.
It depends on what the intended use is. Certainly you can have a situation in which two people own as partners a piece of real estate. You could do that with almost any kind of property, even if it can't be physically divided. Okay, anybody else? Okay, hopefully I will see you all next Monday. Hopefully in better health for me and good health for everybody. And have a wonderful week. Good night.